What is happening in Egypt? The nation seems to be spiraling out of control, caught in a net of violence and chaos. Recently, 683 Muslim Brotherhood followers have been sentenced to death as a new military government consolidates its strength. This sentence includes Mohamed Morsi, the formerly elected president of Egypt, who was ousted from power by a military coup. Before this sentence, 527 Muslim Brotherhood followers had been sentenced, a total of 1,210 Egyptians sentenced to death. Here in America, we find this deeply troubling. What does all this mean? What are we to do about it? And who are the real enemies here? The Middle East is a complicated region which, quite frankly, seems to scare most Americans, for the simple reason that most Americans know very little about it. But this does not have to be the case. In this speech, I'd like to explain some of the factors at work in the Middle East and explain the steps necessary to protect the United States against international terrorism. But first, I'd like to present some background on the issue. International terrorism is not a new issue. In fact, its history goes back long before the September 11, 2001 attacks. Al-Qaeda, one of the largest and best-known international terror organizations, has been responsible for terrorist attacks since the mid-1990s. More recently, Al-Qaeda has undergone a major change in structure. Instead of a closely knit, centrally controlled organization, Al-Qaeda has come to resemble a business franchise, with loosely connected branches in many nations. Its leadership has become much less centralized, to the point that Al-Qaeda has been described as a regional syndicate. This change in structure is making Al-Qaeda very hard for the US military to deal with, not to imply that the struggle was easy in the first place. In fact, since 2001, the global war on terror, as President Bush named it, has cost the United States almost $1.5 trillion, and 300,000 lives have been lost in this war, almost half of them civilians.
Can you raise your stand, please? Thank you.
In this speech, I will contend that cultural reform of the Middle East is necessary to defeat Islamic jihadism. In proving this thesis, I will present 3 primary points. First, I'd like to explain how Arabic culture both influences and is influenced by radical elements in Arabic societies. Next, I will contend that trying to change a culture is morally justifiable. And last but certainly not least, I'll explain some specific methods for reducing international terrorism. My first contention is to explain how Arabic culture contributes to the phenomenon of terrorism. To start with, I would like to explain that Arab culture differs from American culture in several key points, first and foremost of which is the idea of responsibility. Arab men have a tendency to blame their wives, sisters, and daughters for everything. Before I'm accused of generalizing, I must make it clear that this is not just a slight difference. Lying is actually encouraged in Arabic culture, because admitting that you're wrong or made a mistake is seen as losing face. Just like Arab men blame their wives and daughters for everything, it is a practice of Arabic national leaders to blame various scapegoats for national problems, especially the United States and Israel. Israel and the West are portrayed as evil and as trying to destroy all the good that Arabic culture stands for. It has been said that a tyrant requires an enemy to stay in power. Arabic governments are generally not only despotic, but also largely inept. Thus, the fear of outside enemies is necessary for these governments to stay in power. In this case, Israel and the West serve as the bad guys. This bad guy mentality trickles all the way down to the individual Muslim, who views Israel as evil and trying to dominate the world, and America as a cesspool of immorality. Although Arabic culture is largely dissimilar to American culture, there are also similarities. One such similarity is the deep divisions in the culture. Much like progressives and conservatives in the United States, Arab nations are politically split in a number of different ways. Most importantly to us, they are divided into radical and moderate elements. The radical elements usually form no more than 15% of the population of a nation, but they hold the other 85% of the population in fear through their threats and violence. It is this small radical element which carries out attacks against the US, which fills the streets of Arab nations with violence, propaganda, and flat-out lies about the West, all in the name of Allah. Simply because only 15% of the population can be defined as radicals certainly doesn't mean that the rest of the population is innocent. In fact, most Muslims are neutral or tacitly support the actions of the radicals. Thus the radicals feed off the support of the masses, and the Muslim masses are influenced by the propaganda of the radicals, a never-ending loop in which hatred for the West steadily grows. There is one last reason why Arab culture needs to change. As long as Arabs consider all non-Muslims as heretics, the true word of God can make little headway in Arabic nations. But a relaxation of hatred towards the West on the part of the Arab peoples would make evangelism in Arab nations significantly easier. Although this is a religious, rather than a social or political reason for changing the Arab culture, it is perhaps the most important reason for us as Christians. Now that we have looked at how the culture of the Middle East contributes to terrorism, I'd like to move on to my next contention. In this contention, I will explain that changing a culture, such as the Arab culture, is morally justifiable. As Americans, we have a long history of tolerance of many cultures. So many people are likely to ask, do we, as Americans, have the right to attempt to change the Arab culture? The main justification for attacking a culture is found in history. In fact, it can be contended that every great international war was a clash of cultures. From the Battle of Salamis, which caused the fall of the Persian culture, to the Crusades, which proved the dominance of Christian over Muslim culture, to the American Revolution, which showed the decline of British culture, to most recently the fall of the Berlin Wall, which showed the failure of communist culture. All these battles have been clashes between cultures. This clash between Western and Arabic culture is not unprecedented. But what is unprecedented is that historically, a culture has been defeated by military and economic might, not by direct cultural attack. The goal in this case, instead of trying to defeat the opponent militarily, is to change their culture from within. It is still a clash of cultures, but simply because a clash of cultures is justified, is this method of carrying out the clash justified? The answer to that question, in a word, is yes. Muslim terrorists do not submit to the rules of armed combat which the West has adopted, and instead try to instill a culture of terror in their opponents and their own people. They use this culture as a weapon against us, against the lives of American citizens. Thus, we, as their opponents, are justified in trying to break the culture of fear that they have created around their own people as a way of defending ourselves. Freedom of beliefs is important, but when it becomes a weapon, it needs to be... Freedom of beliefs is important, but does not justify the killing of other people. There are many possible objections to this idea of trying to change the Arab culture. To start with, it can be argued that the actions of Muslim terrorists can be justified as a reaction in defense against the immoral culture of the West. The problem with this idea is that it is only partially true. The Arab world might have valid complaints against the West, but radical elements have turned these issues from problems to be resolved into causes of sheer irrational hatred. The complaints that Arabs have against Westerners are not the cause of terrorism, but rather a tool the terrorists use to inflame Muslim masses. It can also be argued that terrorism is a result of poor economic circumstances. However, the statistics do not support this claim. Effectively, poor Islamic nations or Islamic nations with declining economies have not been shown to have any higher level of terrorism than richer countries or countries with rising economies. Thus, terrorism is not a result of poverty, nor is it a result of Western culture, but it is inherent in Islamic society. To explain the necessity of cultural change in the Arab world, and the moral justification for that cultural change, the question quickly arises: what exactly does this cultural change look like? How are we to change the Arab culture to make it less threatening to the West? In my last contention, I'd like to explain the specific methods for reducing the phenomenon of international terrorism. In short, America needs to win the war for the heart of Islam. The deep divide between the radicals and the moderns in Arab culture is the root of most conflict in the Muslim world, and the existence of radical factions is a cause of terrorism against the West. Thus, by reducing or eliminating these radical factions, violence by Arabs, both against their neighboring Arabs and against the West, can be reduced or eliminated. There are two primary methods that I believe should be employed against radical Islamic factions. First, supporting secular rather than Islamic governments in Muslim countries. and second, attacking radical factions within Muslim nations. There are not many secular governments of Muslim nations, but one good example is the nation of Turkey. Turkey has a free market, a remarkable degree of civil liberties for a Middle Eastern nation, and a membership in NATO. This kind of government is friendly to the West and extremely hostile to radical Islamic elements. More of these kinds of governments in the Middle East would be very good, but if we expect this kind of government to proliferate, we need to lend our full support to the already existing Turkish government and encourage creation of similar governments in the area. In addition to supporting secular governments, the U.S. needs to attack radical factions on their own soil. There are a variety of strategies to do this. The recent Hosni Mubarak of Egypt and King Hussein of Jordan, although certainly not considered friendly to the West, have both felt threatened by radical factions within their nations. The U.S. State Department has a long tradition of supporting the lesser evil against the greater. In keeping with this tradition, the United States should aid national leaders who try to fight terrorists in their own countries. In this speech, I have tried to prove that cultural reform in the Middle East will be required to defeat Islamic jihadism. To prove this, I have presented 3 main points. First, that the culture of the Middle East encourages terrorism. Second, that attempting to reform the culture of the Middle East is morally justifiable. And last, that there are specific things that America can do to combat terrorism at the cultural level. The threat of communism seems to be gone now, but we must be wary of new threats on the global landscape. It is vital that we recognize that the so-called green threat of Islamic jihadism is just as much a threat to our nation as the so-called red threat of communism was. Current military strategy in the Middle East has only enjoyed a limited degree of success. We must employ new strategies if we are to stem the green tide of Islamic jihadism.
And just go ahead and end your speech by saying thank you. Just
Thank you.
do that automatically so that everybody knows that's the end. Okay, couple of questions here. You're suggesting to change a country so that we can evangelize?
Yes, that would be part of the reason, yes. Effectively, there are multiple reasons why we need to change their nations, and that is one of them.
Will everyone agree with that? As a world economy, I'm sure it'd be nice for the Christians in America to see more nations become Christian. But
I have written this thesis from a Christian viewpoint, and so that is my personal belief.
okay, may I just say that one of the really cool things about Christianity is that although we may not agree with all the other religions in terms of our profession, we certainly believe, because God chooses His own, that each person can have their own religion.
That is true. But that doesn't mean that we aren't, as Christians, we know that we are to attempt to evangelize the world. And in this case, we have an opportunity to make evangelism easier, while at the same time protecting the nation with the greatest Christian heritage currently on earth.
I suggest that you sidestep that whole issue and say that might be a benefit if the culture was changed, but that you don't necessarily, in other words, I wouldn't put forward that you want to change that just so that we can evangelize. Okay, let's see here. Do you have a refutation in your speech?
I do. I only have a couple points in my refutation.
Can you go over where that is?
All right.
Zach, while he's looking, did you have,
I have a lot of questions if you'd like me to ask.
I do, did you have a refutation in yours?
I do not have a reputation in mind.
Do they normally put reputations in there?
Some of them have them, and the thesis manual
I know.
It says, if it's sure to come up, include it, but
question that you know will be asked, refute it in your speech to avoid.
Okay. Did you do, or yours whole is a whole big thing of reputation, okay?
My reputation is basically, I present two counter arguments. First, that terrorism is a reaction against the Western culture, and second, that terrorism is a result of poverty.
Okay.
I explained those two and did those.
Isn't your reputation, shouldn't it be that you're suggesting changing the culture as opposed to striking on them militarily? That
Okay.
ultimately, changing the culture will diffuse the situation.
Exactly.
Now, where in there do you say that militarily it's not working?
At the very end, I kind of mentioned in passing, that was actually my because clause, was that military solutions have not proven effective.
Okay,
Again, I say, current military strategy in the Middle East has only enjoyed a limited degree of success. We must employ new strategies if we are to stem the green tide of Islamic jihadism.
okay. I think alrighty. Zach has got a bunch of good questions.
Islam is derived from the Arabic word for submission. Isn't Islam a religion of peace?
Islam is not a religion of peace. As I mentioned earlier, Islamic society is widely divided, and so just like in America we have many Christians who say that they're Christians. My pastor would call them Christmas and Easter Christians. They show up on Christmas and Easter. There was a time they don't show up for church. There are many Muslims who are Muslims in name only, and these are generally the moderates. There are many Muslims who are very devoted, but also are very peaceful. There is, however, as I mentioned, that 15% of the population which believes that their religion requires the slaughter of as many people as possible.
Okay. Wouldn't forcing a culture to change cause animosity between the two cultures? For example, when you think of Greece and Persia, the Greeks didn't just roll over and let Persia change them.
Well, that's because in that case the culture was changed by military force. In this case, this would be more political means, as a student once said, using the 4 tools of international diplomacy. No, it's not international diplomacy. Diplomacy.
Foreign policy.
Sorry, foreign policy.
National
Diplomacy.
security.
Information domination, military strength, and economic tools. That third one, military strength, would be a very minor one, whereas the first two and the last one, effectively diplomacy, information domination, and economic domination would be the most effective tools in this case. Because, for that very reason, that military domination does cause animosity.
Clashes of cultures exist, but should they exist?
Well, sin also exists, and sin should not exist. I don't think that it's necessarily a question of whether or not they should exist, but whether it is in fact possible to exist without them. Effectively,
So in a perfect world, we wouldn't have culture clashes.
in a perfect world, yes, I do not believe that we would have any of these clashes between cultures. But unfortunately, we do not live in a perfect world, and I do not believe that these clashes are avoidable.
Do you see, do you see this cultural change that you're proposing should be the strategy? Do you see that as covert?
Well, rather like President Reagan put together a specific strategy for attacking communism, that was not necessarily a covert strategy, it was just something that they put together and employed. I believe that this should be very much a similar thing. I mean, we wouldn't broadcast it to every Muslim in the world, but there's no need to keep it necessarily secret per se. It's just a policy that we need to undertake, and since the policies will not be, as I say, since they won't be really military, since they won't be primarily military, they won't require any great degree of secrecy. Does that answer your question?
So how exactly are you suggesting that we change the culture?
Primarily through supporting secular governments in the area and aiding governments who fight against radical Islamic factions.
Did you say that in your paper?
Maybe I didn't emphasize it enough.
Because those were your two.
That was the
First
evil
and second
versus
point.
lesser.
In my last contention. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
This is kind of a multi-step question, and I think, so hang with me. What do you think is the root cause that has caused the terrorists to dislike America, to be terrorists?
There's a lot of disagreement on that topic. Some would say that it's because of American invasions. Some would say that it's because of American immorality. I believe that those do play a factor. It does seem that Arabic hatred of the West is largely a form of envy, because before the rise of, after the fall of the Roman Empire, Arabs for a long time really were the ruling force in the world, and they like to remind us that algebra is derived from the Arabic algebra. I didn't pronounce that properly, but so they like to claim a bunch of historical accomplishments and claim that they were once the greatest culture on earth, but that has since been stolen from them by the West.
Okay. So, is that something that we will ever be able to change? We talk about wanting to change their culture. How are we going to change it if
Well, once
if
again,
it's based mostly on their envy of our society?
I'd like to point to Turkish culture. I didn't explain this a lot in my paper. I talked mostly about the government, not so much about the culture. But the Turkish people are Muslim people who are much closer to the West than they are to the Muslim world. And so I think that this illustrates that eventually it is possible that they can overcome their envy, largely due to the success and wealth that the Western way of life brings.
And you said that there was a change in the Turkish view, that they have become more westernized. What are some of the things that you researched this in your paper? What are some of the ways that brought about that change?
Interestingly, when the Egyptian president Nidhar Sadat, I believe, don't quote me on that because I'm not sure if that was the president, but an Egyptian president who tried to make peace with Israel was assassinated, and Turkish citizens effectively came out to the streets and basically were riding on the streets carrying signs saying that those who want Sharia law need to go to Iran. It wasn't just a passive denial of support for this action, it was open anger against those who had committed it. And I think that demonstrates a pretty significant cultural change on the behalf of those people.
Why is that?
I believe that it's largely due to the Turkish government, which obviously there's a limited degree to which a government can and should affect the people. But the Turkish government is secular and has for a long time enforced a secular law and has effectively promoted a very Western way of life, which has proven remarkably successful in that country. And I believe that as the benefits of that have become apparent, that the Turkish people have realized that, I don't want to be so arrogant as to say that they have realized the folly of their ways, but they have realized the advantage of that way of life over the radical Muslim way of life.
Do you think that the Turkish government is changing? I mean, do you see any changes that are coming up, that may not hold true anymore?
So far as the very recent history of the Turkish government, I can't say a lot. I haven't done a lot of research on that specific time frame. I do know that it is consistently under attack from radical factions and radical governments in every way, militarily, economically, politically. It is constantly under all forms of attack, and it very well might have succumbed to some of the pressure.
Very good response. Okay, thank you. Did you have a question?
Did America have anything to do with the Turkish government becoming what it is, evolving into more secular government?
That is an excellent question. I don't know. I have not done any research on the part, so.
Okay, thank you. Oh, got another.
I have one last question. Our culture has gone from greatness to decadence. As we look at our culture and its destruction of Christian values, can we really claim that our culture is the best? And as we reflect upon how we evaluate values as it is, can we really claim that any culture is great?
Well, yes, we can. Once again, speaking from a Christian worldview, I could defend this from a non-Christian worldview, but it would require a whole different set of arguments. So, from a Christian worldview, America is founded on Christian values. And despite being constantly under attack, those values have remained strong in this country, stronger than any other nation on earth. I think it is fairly safe to say. As of such, although we might not be the best nation in the world, as a fellow student of mine once said, we are still the most moral nation on earth. And thus, if no one will assume the mantle of leadership against Islamic terrorism, I mean, if we won't assume the mantle of leadership against Islamic terrorism, then no one will.
That was a good question. All right, I think we need to move on. How long was that Q&A?
14 minutes, 49 seconds.
Okay.
Could I use the restroom?
Yes,
before
we need to take a break,
All right.
and then we'll reassemble here in about 3 or 4 minutes.
Thank you.